So I am at St. Charles Church in Burlington, Washington. And as you can see in the sanctuary space behind me has some beautiful icons of Our Lady, of St. Joseph, and also of the Passion scene, the crucifixion scene. And so I love having things behind me that are very, very beautiful, and so I wanted you to all be able to see that. Today is not a weekend, and I'm not giving my homily from a weekend mass. Rather, this is from the feast day of St. John Vianney, so August 4th. In the gospel reading today, we have the story of Peter and Jesus, and the disciples are around, but it's really between Peter and Jesus. And so there's Matthew chapter 16, and this is where Jesus asks his disciples, and Peter is the first to respond, and he asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" And so Peter, just without any hesitation, just by faith, he knows what to say. And so he says, "You are the Son of God, you're the Messiah." And so you have that beautiful scene there, but then that scene quickly changes as soon as Jesus tells Peter and the disciples that he's going to need to suffer and die. And then that interaction between Peter and Jesus turns a little bit in a different direction. I'll go into that. So today is the feast day of St. John Vianney. St. John Vianney is the patron saint of diocesan priests. And so this is a huge, huge celebration for us as parish priests. It's a time today. It's difficult to be a good, holy parish priest. There's many, many challenges, and maybe there have always been challenges, but it just seems like in particular with us trying to draw the culture, draw people in who are not of faith, but in that it seems like there's a real hostility towards Jesus. And so it makes it very, very challenging to try to do that as a parish priest. So on today's feast day, we really look to our mentor, to our patron, for his intercession. I want to share a couple stories with you about St. John Vianney. When St. John Vianney would talk about prayer, it was very simple. He would talk about being in love. And so when people would see him praying, and so he would just be sitting in one of these pews, and he would be looking, he would have the tabernacle obviously up in the sanctuary space, and so he'd be praying before Jesus. And people would ask him and say, well, what are you doing when you're praying? What are you saying? Because perhaps he had no books in front of him, he was just sitting there. And so his response to that was, I look at the good God, and the good God looks at me. It's just simply being in love. It's simply sitting there with the one whom he loves. When people ask me also, they ask that question, and it's hard to answer because people say, well, what are you doing? Because we want to be doing something, right, in prayer. And it's not so much of doing, it's being in love. That's the prerequisite. You have to be in love to want to just sit there and be with our Lord, to sit at his feet, if you will. You know, you could think of a marriage. You don't always have to be talking to each other to express your love. There's sometimes you just want to be together because you're in love. And so you feed off of that presence of the other person, off of that love. And it gives you courage, it gives you warmth, it gives you everything that you need. And so to do that with God is incredible. You know, when you get up in the morning and you're going down for breakfast, you don't bring down a book with you and tell your spouse, okay, today I'm going to read for you these 100 pages to prove that I love you. So prayer doesn't have to be that, right? It doesn't have to be something that you've just accomplished. Now, words in prayer are important, don't get me wrong, but to be with the good God, to look at him and to allow him to look at you deeply, that is powerful. And so that's from St. John Vianney. the simplicity of that childlike faith. There's another story, a little anecdote about him. So when he was first made pastor of the little tiny village called Ars, he was on his way to the village, and so he was walking along the path, and at some point, as the story goes, he got lost. I think there was fog, and he just got a little disorientated. So St. John Vianney was not the most cleverest of people in worldly ways, and so to see him getting lost on his way to his parish, you could see that as happening. So he gets lost, and so at one point he reaches the crossroads, and he doesn't know which way to go. So he sits down, and he opens up his breviary for his liturgy of the hours, and he just starts praying his prayers. And he's like, well, God will show me the way. And so he sits down on a rock right beside the road and just starts praying. Well, a little while later, a little boy comes along. And this little boy is just kind of doing what little boys do. He's just journeying along. And so Father Vianney turns to him and says, do you know the way to Ars? And the little boy says, yes, I know the way to Ars. And so St. John Vianney says, if you show me the way to Ars, I will show you the way to heaven. Again, it's just that childlike, that beautiful, simple faith that he could say with such conviction that he knows the way to heaven, the same way that child knows the way to his future parish. And so as the child shows him, he also shows this child the way to heaven. He would give his life to the people of Ars. He would spend his entire priesthood there. And the first 5 years or so were very, very challenging. This was right after the French Revolution. And so most of the priests and religious were chased out of the country during that time, or they were executed. Some of them were executed. And so St. John Vianney grows up in the midst of that. And so he's going back to a village that has not had a priest or a resident priest in many, many years. And the effects of that negligence, of that neglect, were very apparent. There were multiple drinking establishments, multiple bars in the town, and yet no one was going to church, no one was practicing their faith. And so he rebuilt that village in faith from the ground up. He showed them the way to heaven. And by the time he had passed away, the people recognized that they had a saint in their midst. There's a great story about St. John Vianney. He often felt a bit out of place in the parish, and he always had this longing to go to a monastery and just to be by himself, just to pray, and as he would say, just to have time to weep over his sins. And so he just wanted to get away sometimes. He'd become overwhelmed with what was happening in his little parish in the town. And I think there were 3 or 4 occasions where he really tried to actually flee the town, to get away, to go to a monastery. And there's this one story about this one time where it was late at night and he was praying and he had made up his mind that he was going to leave. And so as he did that, he hears this horse-drawn carriage pull up right in front of the rectory. And this man knocks on the door. And so he goes and he opens the door, and it's kind of this dark, mysterious-looking person. And he says, "Come with me. I'll take you to the monastery. You can get away." And he began to immediately realize that this was Satan. Satan did appear to St. John Vianney on multiple occasions because St. John Vianney was such a threat to Satan. There's once this incident that happened where Satan appeared to him and he said if there were, and I don't remember the number, but he said something like, if there were just a handful of people like you, I would lose this war. I would lose everybody. So he really considered St. John Vianney to be a threat. And so he wants to pull him out of the parish because he's doing too much damage. He's leading too many people to God. And that's when St. John Vianney realized this was what Satan wanted. It was not from God. He belonged with his people. And he needed to carry his cross in the midst of his people. Now I want to go to the gospel. And so I already said earlier what the gospel was about. But there's this interaction between Peter and Jesus. Peter has good faith, but he does not yet have great faith. He has good faith in that he can see Jesus for who he is, and he can point to him and say, that is the Son of God. That is the Messiah. And he wants to follow him. That's good faith. But it's not sufficient. So it's kind of like when God comes to you and there's something happening in your life that causes you affliction. There's something difficult going on in your life. And you can endure it. You take it. And you pray about it. And you survive through it. And you carry your cross. And so you have good faith. But then when God tries to do something like that with one of your loved ones, with your spouse or with your kids, and they then have to carry a cross that you cannot carry for them, you don't like that. You want to protect them. You want to take that cross away from them, and you want to take it all upon yourself. And that's bad. And so that's where Peter and Jesus are today. Peter needs great faith. He has to allow Jesus to fulfill his mission. He has to allow Jesus to suffer also. He thinks he can protect Jesus. He thinks he can protect him and guard him and take all the suffering upon him. And that's not good faith. That's not great faith, I should say. He has to allow Jesus to work. And so sometimes in our lives, we have to have enough faith to trust God to work in our loved ones as well. And we have to allow them to suffer or to carry a cross and trust that God is working in their life too, and that we don't need to intervene and stop God. And so that's where that true faith comes in, that great faith. There's an example of this in St. John Vianney's life. When he was in Ars, he began to notice that there was a number of young girls in the village who were orphans. And they were kind of getting bounced from house to house. They weren't getting really taken care of in a good way. And so he decided to start a school, a boarding school, a place for these orphan girls to live, to go to school, to have a loving environment. But he had no resources to do this. And so when he first started talking about doing this, the people in the village are like, well, okay, are you going to bring in a group of religious sisters, or what buildings are you going to use, or how are you going to do this in a practical way? St. John Vianney wasn't a very practical man. He just would always point to heaven. And so he named the school Providence. It's very appropriately named because he was going to need God's providence on multiple occasions. But when he was thinking and praying about who would lead the school, he had two people in mind. And there was these two young women in the village of Ars. They were very holy women. They were very good Catholic young ladies. And so he went to them and he said, I need somebody to start this school and to run it. I need somebody to love these girls, to help them grow closer to God, and to have a safe home. So he's essentially saying, I need somebody to be a mother to these orphan girls. And he told these two young women, he says, all I have to give you in return is a place to stay and some food to eat. And in return, you will give your life to these girls. Now, I want to offer that this is an example of great faith, because he wasn't hesitant to allow these two young women to say yes to carrying a very big cross. They're going to give their life to these girls. That will be their life. And so, in a sense, they're not going to have a family of their own, but they're agreeing to just give themselves to these girls. In fact, they don't even have a religious community. They don't even have a group of sisters to support them. They're kind of all on their own. And so St. John Vianney was not hesitant to ask them to do that. And that's great faith. When we can allow God to work in our neighbor, in our loved ones, and we can allow them even to suffer a little bit for the sake of growing and also striving to be a person of great faith. All right, God bless you and happy feast day.